Okay, we're live. All right, good morning, everybody. Good morning. I'm doing wonderful. You joining the class?
Yeah, I just didn't know if I was.
You got the right place.
Okay,
Come on in.
yeah.
All right, good morning, everybody. Grab a bagel if you'd like. And here's some photocopies, paper, pen. All right, let's get going here. All right, let's see if we can do a brief summary. For those of you that are here for the first time, for the most part, we study discourses, and they, depending on how much we get distracted, it could be 4 or 5 classes, it could be 20 classes, but every week we always study some new interesting ideas. So this discourse explores the nature of man's purpose on this earth. And the premise, the dilemma, is presented as follows, that person is the microcosm. So if we look at the human experience, we're able to then reflect back on God. The Torah tells us that man is created in God's image. So if we look at the human, we are a reflection of the divine. So if we understand the function of the body with all of its complexities, we get a glimpse into the function of the divine. We communicate when the essence of the person communicates through 3 primary functions: thought, speech, and action. When I do something, I'm expressing myself in some manner, but the expression of what I'm doing is very distant from the I. I pour myself a cup of water, I pour you a cup of water. That's an action that once I've done it, I'm completely removed from it. And it is completely removed from me. It's an external expression. It doesn't tell you much about me, right? It just tells you that I have the ability to pour water. When I speak, speech is a greater reflection of the I, because it's an expression of what I'm thinking about. And when I speak, speech is more ethereal. So even though it does, so to speak, separate from me, but there's still a stronger connection than there is in the case of action. And then there's thought. When I'm thinking, my thoughts are intimately connected with me. You can't see what I'm thinking. Even when I speak, you have an idea of what I'm thinking, but only vis-a-vis what I'm expressing to you. So thought is the most intimate connection with the I, but it's not the I, it's an expression of the I. We read at the beginning of the Torah about creation, and if you're familiar with the opening verses of Bereshis of Genesis, we find the expression, and God said, let there be light, and God said, let there be a firmament. God is speaking all the time. Creation, as we know it, is a manifestation of God's speech. In God's case, speech is action. The verse says, Bidvar Hashem Shamayim Nasu, with the word of God, the heavens were made. So for God, speech is action. For humans, speech is the next step in the process. The souls originate in divine thought. Yisrael alu b'machshava. Israel came up in God's primordial thought. We originate in God's primordial thought, which means that we are higher than creation. When I say we, I mean the soul, the essence of who we are. So when the soul comes down to earth to live in this complicated world, it begs the question, what is the upside for the soul? Right? There may be an upside for the world, but what's the upside for the soul? You can't take something that's so high and lofty and send it down, and it just comes back to where it came from, and there's no upside for it, right? Everybody woke up this morning, we're going to do productive things today, or unproductive things, that's fine as well. But there's a purpose in all of it, right? If you decide today is going to be an unproductive day, you want to just relax, you want to take it easy. That's productive. The unproductiveness of doing nothing is productive. We don't do things, a healthy human being doesn't do things or doesn't not do things if there's no upside to it. So if a soul is coming all the way down to this earth, only to go back exactly where it came from, it begs the question, what's the upside for that? So the Alter Rebbe, the author of this discourse, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, tells us that there are two ways that we come to a relationship with God. The first is through utilizing the function of the body. We contemplate, we think about the world around us, we think about the experience around us, the beautiful nature, the complexity of the human being, the vastness of the oceans, the skies, the planets, the galaxies. We move into the spiritual realms, what we understand of the spiritual realms about angels and so on and so forth. And the more we contemplate this, the more we explore the vastness and the greatness of nature, and the more we understand, the more we come to love God. Maybe a decent parallel for this is when one is married or in a love relationship, love should actually, I remember when I was dating, and in our circles, we don't date for a very long time. So I actually knew Dina because I grew up with her brother and was at her house many times, but we didn't have much to do with each other because it was not the appropriate thing in our community. But then we dated, and after a couple of dates, I told my father that I think I'm in love. So my father said to me, "You're not in love, you're in lust." He says, "You don't fall in love after 4 dates, no matter how long those dates are." And there's a great story that's told. There was a woman, her name is Hannah Sharpstein. Her father was a rabbi in Chicago, probably in the 50s. I believe she's still alive. And her father was actually killed mistakenly by the mafia. On a Friday night going home from services, they pulled up in a car and they mistook him for someone, and they shot him point blank right there in front of her and her mother. Anyway, she built this relationship with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And at one point, it came time for her to start dating. She was studying at a university in New York. And the Rebbe said, "No, it's time to get married. It's time to settle down." So she says, "I haven't found the right one yet." So the Rebbe says, "Tell me about the people in your life." So she started telling the Rebbe, "There's this guy, and this is why he's not for me. And there's this guy, and this is why he's not for me." The Rebbe said, "No, is there anybody else?" He says, "Yeah, there's one other guy." She described him, and the Rebbe said, "He's for you." So the Rebbe said, "You have a notion of love from the novels that you read, right? What happens in a novel? It's love at first sight. it's blissful, it's wonderful, and you ride off into the sunset and you live happily ever after. It's not how it works, right? We fall in love, whatever that really means. And probably there's a period of infatuation. And then real life sets in. When real life sets in, that's when a relationship gets tested. Because the choice at that point is, are you really going to learn? Are you really going to learn about the other person? Are you going to invest yourself in trying to understand the other person? And if you're in a committed relationship, then that's what you do. You invest yourself. Nobody's perfect. We try to understand the other person, try to understand where they come from, what are their idiosyncrasies, why do they act in a certain way, how do they bump up against your complexities and your parts, and so on and so forth. And together you navigate life together. You have children, you navigate the complexities of having children, you build a home, the complexities of home ownership. You travel together, you experience life's blessings and life's challenges. And the more we get to know someone, the more we spend time trying to understand another person, the love intensifies. It doesn't look like that young love, which is a love of infatuation, which looks really wonderful and very tempting, right? And that's why a lot of people have this notion that that's what love is from the movies and whatnot. And when that dries up, which it inevitably does, they throw their hands up. They throw the towel in. But that's exactly the point where the relationship really gets started. And that's our first love. Our love with God, as King Solomon says in Song of Songs, is a parallel. It's we understand love with God from our love with another human. So we try to learn about God. And we can spend a lifetime and we'll never fully understand, obviously, because God is infinite. But the more we study, the more we learn, the more we try to comprehend, the more that love grows. And in Kabbalistic language, it's called ahavas olam, which means love that comes from the world. It literally means love world, but it's love of God that comes from our experience of the world. So that's one type of love. Then there's another type of love. And the other type of love is called ahava rabbah, which means great love, this abundant love. And you can't earn it. You can't work your way into that love. It's a gift. And what it is an exposure of the soul. The soul just gets exposed. The soul inherently is in love with God. The reason we don't experience that love is because the body hides it. The body conceals it. The body's got its own selfish interests. So the body hides that love. But there are moments where we get this experience, this profound experience, this expression of the soul that's just overwhelming. And it doesn't get in the way. It pushes everything else out of the way. When do we get to experience that? So there are certain times during the year that there's a specific opportunity. On Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, these are days that are very powerful, where the soul is more awake, so to speak. When we face serious challenge, that we can't rationalize our way through it, that's when the soul has its moment to shine. In other words, when I can rationalize why I should do this or not do this vis-a-vis my relationship with God, then I'm operating from a finite place. I'm operating from an intellectual place that by definition, the intellect is finite. But sometimes we become so preoccupied with something, so obsessed with something, so desirous of something that we can't control it. And at that moment, we have to call on something deeper to help us navigate that difficulty. And that's calling on the depths of the soul. That's calling on this great love to say, hey, I need your help, God. Just help the love come out so I can navigate this challenge. And when that love expresses itself, it's not a rational love. It's a super rational love. And therefore, it has this power to totally push us through and help us achieve what needs to be achieved, whether it's doing a certain thing or not doing a certain thing. So granted, the soul originates in God's primordial thought. But unless the soul comes down to earth, and by thought, we're talking about God's thought, but it still has definition. We're calling it thought. So if it's thought, it means on some dimension, on some spiritual dimension, there's a finitude there. So since the soul originates in God's thought, it's not necessarily accessing the greatest essence of God that it can, because we're calling it thought. It may be a very holy thought, but it's still a spiritual, it's got spiritual limitations to it. But when we come down to this earth and our soul ends up in a physical body and it bumps up against physical limitations, temptations, the body's selfish interests, and we push through that, not because we've rationalized our way there, but because we called on the essence of the soul, the expression that gets manifest then is greater than the soul's own origin. This makes sense? This is essentially what we've studied in the discourse thus far. Any questions? You don't have any questions?
He says you can't read thoughts, but he reads mine all the time.
Tanakh, yeah.
Judaism, Judaic bookstore.
Oh, good.
I started reading it last night. After that, I started on the course with Genesis 1. And
Started from the beginning. It's a good place to start.
And I got a commentary, and it's saying that the
Rashi.
puts emphasis on we shouldn't be so caught up into the 7 days and everything like that. What we need to kind of put emphasis on is the fact that God spoke everything into existence. So I thought that was
Consistent, yeah. Beautiful. Good. Yes.
Where does the love fall?
That's a complicated one. It is because we live in both. We actually, our relationship with our parents actually are made up of both of these dimensions, because we are a part of our parents, and we can never escape that, right? But on the other hand, we have a rationalized experience of that, right? When we think about at any given moment how we show up in the world, or let's say how we show up in our relationship with our parents, is made up of genetics, which is the fact that we are a part of our parents. We are literally made up of their DNA. But we're also influenced by their upbringing, which is a narrative that we tell ourselves about the experience of growing up or being raised by our parents. And that's complicated. That's complex. So there is an inherent connection. So the word in Hebrew for love is ahava. The root of that ahav means to be connected. So we are connected to our parents, whether we like it or not, whether we despise them or are infatuated with them. There is a connection there, which is why relationships with parents are so complex, right? Because we are connected, but then we have this whole other part of us that tells us story. And if we were, and again, we've discussed there's so much awareness today around development of a child and the things that children need at a young age in order to develop into healthy, emotionally well-balanced individuals. But parents are still going to be parents. They're still not going to do things 100% right. And at the end of the day, we have a narrative about our parents. And if your narrative is one that my parents were wonderful and nurturing, and they really were nurturing, so then you're going to have a stronger rational connection with them. And the rational connection influences the emotional connection, right? If it's a negative, it'll be negative. But because we want to be connected, so we can't just ignore it. You can't just say, oh, my parents were awful parents, and I'm just going to ignore them, have nothing to do with them, and I'm going to be totally at ease with that, right? People choose not to have a relationship with their parents, but they're caught up in that. It's like it consumes them. So it's complicated.
Is it supposed to have rational thinking or reasoning, and it is also feelings or emotions, etc. What is the balance, or what is how does it interact with each other, and also how does this relate to the action?
Beautiful. Great, great. This is the core of Chabad philosophy. The word Chabad is an acronym for three Hebrew words: Chachma, Bina, Das, wisdom, understanding, knowledge, and it's the process by which our emotions are developed in a healthy way, or how we check our emotions in a healthy way, with ultimately the objective being, how do we act at the end of the day, right? The Torah doesn't say only do the right thing if you're feeling up to it, right? Only do the right thing. I remember there's a book written by Dennis Prager and Rabbi oh man, Rabbi Tushin. Rabbi Tushin and Dennis Prager wrote a book that I think it's like 20 questions about Judaism or something. He says something very interesting there, that in other faiths, belief is a prerequisite for observance, right? If you don't believe in the God of a particular faith, then it's a non-starter. But nowhere in the Torah does it say you're only obligated to observe the commandments if you believe in God. The Torah says you got to do the right thing, whether you believe it or not, right? It's not a prerequisite. The problem is that I don't want to do the right thing. Right now, I'm feeling selfish. I'm feeling preoccupied with my own interests. I don't want to do the right thing. I want to do what's interesting to me. So how do I influence myself to do the right thing? I can't talk to my heart because the heart is emotion. I can't say, well, you don't want to, but you should want to anyway. Like, how do you make that work? How do you get that started? How do you jumpstart that? So the only way to make that happen is through your brain, through your head. It says, Moyach shalat al halev, the mind controls the heart. It's ruled. By nature, the mind rules the heart. What does that mean, the mind rules the heart? It does mean that even if I don't want to, we say, look, you got to be obedient. It's the way it is. You got to listen to me. But that's not really the magic. The magic is to actually use your mind. Using your mind to go through a process. Why should I do the right thing? What's the purpose in doing the right thing? Who am I? What's my existential purpose on this earth? And so on and so forth. That's chachma, the initial thought, bina, the development of a thought. Until, if we put enough effort in there, then what ends up happening is it translates into the space of das. Das is awareness. Awareness means I understand these things, and now I actually feel them. Not I feel them necessarily in my heart. I know it, right? Sometimes you read something in a book, right? You read something, you study something, and it's all this wonderful academic pursuit. And then you experience it. You say, oh, that's what it was, right? When you say, oh, that's what it was, that's das. You suddenly move from a place of intellect into a place of experience. Das is the transition point between the head and the heart. And actually, it's a difficult transition. It's actually a birthing. If you look at the head is here. It's got an expanse. The heart's over here. It's got a big expanse. It doesn't go straight down. It gets narrow. So there's a birth canal between the intellect and emotion. It's very difficult moving intellect into the heart. It requires good information and meditation, contemplation at great length. The great masters are people who take the time to think, who take the time to really, really process the information, to really connect with the information. If we do that effectively, eventually it moves into the place of the heart. When it moves into the place of the heart, then we're in a position to say, I want to do something else, but I understand and I experience a different way of being. And that's how it translates down into action. So you could discipline yourself, right? You could discipline yourself and say, I feel otherwise, but I'm going to do the right thing. And by the way, that's not a bad starting point, right? It's not a bad starting point. I don't mean this in a loaded way. It's animalistic. What I mean by that is you take an animal, you take a puppy, right? You're training a puppy. This is not a rational conversation. You're training the puppy, whether you're on the positive side of training or the negative side of training, right? If you go to the bathroom outside and not in the house, you get an extra whatever puppies eat. And or if the puppy pees on the carpet, put him in timeout, whatever. I've never trained a puppy, so those of you that have know what I'm talking about, right? Or if you want the horse to move, you give the horse a kick, right? You're sending a message. So there is a place that our body is called the animal soul. So we could discipline the animal soul to just do the right thing. I'm not in the mood. So what? You get out of bed anyway, because that's what we have to do. And that's okay. It's a good starting point. But the Shema tells us, and you shall love Hashem, your God, with all your hearts. The goal is not to just be obedient. The goal is to energize the body, that the body itself should want to serve God, even if it's for its own interests. The body says, hey, I can either do what's good for what I'm interested in doing, or I can do what my soul wants me to do. We were talking about this Friday night. There's a saying out there, there's nothing that tastes so good like skinny, right? So we were talking about this. We were saying there's nothing that tastes so good like self-control. So you say, I can do what's in my interest, my indulgence, and I'll have the pleasure of whatever it is I'm indulging in. Or I can say, this is not right for me. This is not good for me, and I'm not going to do it. So I'm depriving myself in a sense of something. But how does it feel when you look back and said, I didn't give in. I didn't have that extra piece of cake. It feels not bodily, but spiritually, spirit. I don't mean necessarily like godly, but just from a spirit standpoint, right? Is it fun running a marathon? It's not. Is it fun going to the gym and burning your muscles? It isn't. It feels good. Why do people say it feels good? Give me a massage. That feels good. You want me to lift weights? That hurts. But I'll do it anyway because it feels good. What does it mean feels good? It feels good that I did something that's for my well-being, and that I pushed myself and I did something that was hard for me. So the first stage is the discipline. I got to do what's right. The second stage is to incorporate love of God into that, to recognize that in doing the right thing, it's in my own interest to do the right thing, both because it feels good and because ultimately it is for my good.
So, how do you know what's the right thing?
The Torah tells us what's the right thing. That's our moral guidebook.
So if I ever have like some sort of a issue or conundrum that I'm dealing with, I need to go to the Torah and look and find.
You were at the class last week, right? This is it was very, in the class we discussed last week, was very, very articulate about the guidelines. Now, people, what we studied last week was the guidelines for how Israel ought to approach what's going on in the world. That was we did a special class last week. The guidelines are there. Do people want to follow them? Why do people not follow them? Because it's uncomfortable. What's uncomfortable? It's uncomfortable, the impression of what the world's going to say. Usually, it's not difficult to know what the right thing is. It's not knowing what the right thing is that's usually the problem. The problem is all the rationalizations why in this case it's not that way. But in this case, in this circumstance, it's different. It's not different. It's just like every other circumstance. You just got to be willing to do the right thing. All right, let's go. Chapter 3. So the premise of this discourse was, we're on page 32. The premise of this discourse was the verse from the prophecy of Bilam. And if you recall, the question there was, it says, and who can count the 1/4 of Israel? So what does it mean? It says that the number of the children of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured and cannot be counted. In the Talmud, it challenges this verse, because we have another verse that says, in the verse itself, there seems to be contradictory. It says, and the counting, the number of the children of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured and cannot be counted. So there is no counting. You're saying, and the counting should be that which can't be counted. So then it can't be counted. So then don't call it, and the counting should be. Just say, and the children of Israel cannot be counted. So Umashani, the Talmud answers that the verse is actually telling us two separate things. That when we follow God's will, when we fulfill the will of God, then there is no counting, there is no number. We cannot be counted, we cannot be measured. But when we do not fulfill God's will, then we're on the line, then there's a limitation. Don't panic if this doesn't have a lot of meaning to you just yet. We'll get there. We have to understand, what does it mean like the sand of the sea? What does it mean when the Torah tells us that the children of Israel will be like the sand of the sea? What does it mean? What's the comparison to the sand of the sea specifically? The earth that surrounds the oceans and the rivers becomes sand as it becomes dried out and crumbles into small pieces. This is not the case with the rest of the earth, which are solid clumps of earth, which are moist and somewhat stuck together. We don't mean immediately where the water is coming up on the shore, but you step back a little bit, the sand is very fragmented, right? It's dry, it's fragmented. In general, also by rivers, right? When the water recedes and the earth dries up, it's very small. But other places, the earth is more chunky, it's more solid, moist. Why is that so? Now, the Rebbe says that the oceans and the rivers, they're all about water and moisture. So what do? They draw moisture from the earth around it. So therefore, the earth, the sand that's around the sea, is left with less moisture than earth in other places. Now, what does this mean? What does it have to do? It's not a science class here. What does this have to do with the whole godly mechanism? He says like, the analog is, in general, how God gives life to the worlds. As we discussed, b'dvar Hashem v'ruach piv, with the word of God and the breath of his mouth, hamahava kol hanivraim ma'ayin liyesh, that brings all of creation into existence from nothing into something. In Iksiv, it is written, Vayasas hayam mutzak, eser ba'ama misvasei ad svasei agol saviv, v'chamesh ba'ama kemasiv, v'kav shleishim ba'ama yasav v'esisav. In the book of Kings, there's a long description of the construction of the temple by Solomon in Jerusalem, and a great description of all the different moving pieces. And there's something called Yam Shel Shlomo, which means the Sea of Solomon. It was this massive basin filled with water. And there, in the book, it gives in Kings, it gives us a description of its measurements. And it says like this: and he, King Solomon, made a mikvah, which is a ritual bath for the priests in the temple, and he called it the sea. It was made of one piece of cast metal, 10 amos, which is a biblical measurement in diameter. The top part was circular. It was 5 cubits high, and its circumference was 30 cubits. So it was quite big. Further, it stood on top of 12 metal statues of cows, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, 3 facing east. And this sea, this mikvah, was situated on top of them, and the backs of the cows were facing towards the center. So just get the visualization, right? You have 3 metal cows, their heads facing that way, their backs here. 3 metal cows facing that way, their backs here, that way, and that way. So their faces are all facing outward. And they're standing, 3 of them are standing next to each other. On top of them is this massive basin. It's a swimming pool made out of metal. It says that its circumference was 30 cubits. So that's let's say there are different opinions how big a cubit is. Let's just say we'll go with the lower one. It's 45 feet, right? So 45 feet, it's pretty big. It's a Olympic-sized swimming pool. Fair? Yeah, Olympic-sized swimming pool is about 45 feet, you would say, circular. Anyways, it was a grand event. What is this whole thing all about? Like, what's this big basin of water and these statues of cows? What's this all about? So let's give some explanation before we jump into the text here. So we know there are 4 worlds, which we discussed earlier on in the discourse a little bit more at length. The first world is the world of Atzilus, translated as the world of emanation. Each world, and then you have the world of creation, you have the world of formation, and the world of action. We live in the physical world of action. That's our universe, is the physical world of action. Each world has 10 levels. We know them as 10 sephiros. These are the building blocks of all of existence. We understand them through language of the microcosm of the body. Meaning, how do we understand God? We only understand a process. And the process we understand is by looking at the human experience and saying, we have 3 intellectual components and we have 7 emotional components. As we said, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And emotions, we have kindness, discipline, compassion, endurance, humility, and bonding. And then the last of the 10 is called nobility. That's the human experience. So we understand if we are created in the divine image and we mirror up to what God might look like, I don't mean necessarily look with our eyes, but what makes God, what makes up the components of God. So the lowest level of the first world is called Malchus, this level of sovereignty. And that particular level is known as a passageway. It's a transition point. The first of the 4 worlds is something separate from the lower 3 worlds. It's a different experience. Not unlike, but not exactly like either, the distinction between thought and speech, right? Thought is much more intimately connected. Speech is already somewhat separated. But the highest of the worlds is even higher than thought in that sense. That means when God manifests himself in his purest state, it's like a blinding light. And in the presence of a blinding light, you can't function. This is even more profound than that. Why? Because in order for us to function, we have to have a sense of self. I exist. There's an I here who's choosing to do one thing versus the other. I'm choosing to see the world in a certain way and act accordingly, right? Everything we've been speaking about requires a sense of I. There has to be an identity, a self-identity. If I don't have that self-identity, then I got nothing to do. But if my only consciousness is a God consciousness, if there is no I, there's only God, then I'm a robot at best. Even angels have a self-consciousness, but their self-consciousness is overridden by the presence, the revelation of God that they experience. So therefore, they're holy robots, okay? But that's what they are. They're robots. They're pre-programmed. But even for them to have an identity, there has to be some kind of separation. The light has to be somewhat diminished so that they could have a sense of self. Let alone us human beings on this earth, for us to be able to even struggle between right and wrong, we have to have a sense of self. So there needs to be a filter between the divine light and that which is created. That filter is known as Malchus. It's the lowest level of the first worlds, the world of emanation, and that is the sea. This sea that King Solomon built represents that filter. And it is sitting on top of the 12 cows, or 4 groups of 3. And these 4 groups represent the 4 camps of the angels. The 4 primary camps of angels are the angels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, also Uriel. Right? So these are the 4 camps of angels, and this basin is sitting on their backs, representing that this level, this filter between the first of the worlds and the next 3 worlds is exalted. It's higher than the angels. Did this make any sense? Yes? Okay. Why is it so big? It's a big filter. It's a big filter. I mean, I don't know. I can't tell you specifically why it's so big, but look, I mean, this filter is all of existence. And we say all of existence, we mean not only, we only know, this is how we talked about building love for God, right? What you can think about, what we human beings have the capacity to think about, there's an interesting idea. There's in intellectual pursuits, there's in Kabbalistic language, there's something called Yedias Hamatzias, knowing what something is. I'm sorry, knowing that something is, and there's Yedias Hamahus, knowing what something is, right? There's 2 different things. I can know that something is, but not know what it is. And then I can know what something is, right? So the further we go away from our immediate experience, we move away from knowing what something is, to some extent knowing that something is, right? You don't know what outer space actually is. The only thing we know what outer space actually is based on projecting our notions of what is, right? I know this is a table. I know what gravity is. So I know what gases are, right? So I know, and I know what light is. So I know when you go into outer space, you have those things in some other dimension. You don't have gravity. You have these light clouds and whatnot. So it's maybe we could say you actually know what it is, maybe. But the further we have this notion of an ever-expanding universe, that makes no sense. I mean, it makes sense, but it makes no sense. You know that it is. You can't really know it. It's irrational. It's beyond our comprehension to understand that something is ever expanding. It's just like, what happens if you take a super fast spaceship and you come to the end of the universe and you break through? What's going to be on? Can you break through? So these are like, I mean, they're silly questions, but the point is that we We know that something is, but we don't know what it is. Everything that we know in the sense of that it is, that we know what it is the lowest level of the lowest world and its physical dimension. So just in terms of levels, to get to this sea, you got to go up 30 levels. And if this is what a physical manifestation looks like, its vastness and its complexities, right? Speak to any scientist of any of the sciences, and there's eternity to learn about this human body, right? To understand the functionality of this human body. I'm reading a book now. Shoot, I'm forgetting the name. See, that's where the brain is going. It's and I don't mean this in a joke, but it's a book about Alzheimer's. Still Alice. I think they turned it into a movie. It's a very powerful book. It's a story about it's a novel about a woman who's a Harvard professor, and she gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's, early on stage Alzheimer's at 51 years old. And it's fascinating because you know of Alzheimer's, unless you've experienced a loved one up close, it's a foreign idea. And this author does a tremendous job, like putting you in the experience and watching the progression of it, right? The disconnect of the different parts of the brain that cause this terrible disease. And you have scientists that are studying, trying to figure out a cure, trying to figure out how to prevent it. So we have all this whole industry of people looking for cures. We don't understand anything, right? Whatever we understand today is light years ahead of what we understood 20, 30, 40 years ago, and light years behind what we're going to know in 20, 30 years. And we'll continue studying this and forever and ever. And the same thing is true with the earth and the oceans and the galaxies and the planets. It's we know so little. We know so minuscule an amount. And this is all one reality of a physical dimension. So if we navigate up to the spiritual worlds where the angels are, right? Read the prophecy of Ezekiel when he ascended to heaven, and it's like, what is he talking about? Like, that's like, so there maybe we know a little bit that it is. We definitely don't know what it is, right? And in order for all of this to come into being, you need this gigantic filter. Without this filter, we're all just one divine consciousness. And by the way, what's really fascinating about this filter is it's a double-edged sword. It has to make sure that the result is that there's a self-consciousness on the other side, but not disconnected so much that we can't have a relationship with God. Enough has to get through that we can have a divine consciousness, that we're moved in this relationship, but not so moved that we lose our free choice. We can't become paralyzed by the light that gets through. But the light also can't be completely shut off. So it's a profound, delicate balance that needs to take place. Yes.
So shouldn't the space being all ever scanning? Yeah, I checked in my head and said, wow, that is true. Like my ability to understand the understanding of it all, like just make me have like a realization, like there's so many. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Like we believe the space is, but how do you have a finite? Like everything in our world is, how do we perceive an infinite? Like, so is there anything different than somebody who's unable to believe the angels, the spiritual realm, that people cannot, just like me, like couldn't perceive the infinite vastness of the space? Like there's some people just don't believe in the spirit, like angels, whatever that is. Is there a term for it?
Yeah, so I think that it's a great question. I think the idea is like this. If you're a believer, right, then the previous Lubavitch Rebbe once said that if somebody says they don't believe them. What does that mean? That means that at our core, at our core, we have faith because we're all connected to the divine. I believe that. I would say more than I believe that, I know that. I know that without a shadow, I know it in the context of that it is, not what it is necessarily, right? I know that this world only exists because God energizes it. I have no doubt about that. I can't tell you exactly that mechanism, but I know that it is. The belief was inherently there. Obviously, it was nurtured by growing up in an environment that believes in that. And then as a student and then as an adult, I studied it. So that solidifies it. And that's a great segue to what the point I want to make. Somebody comes along and says, I don't believe in the spirit. I say, okay, you don't believe. I know that your existence is dependent on this divine energy. How does one bring themselves into that experience? You got to start with studying. It's studying and practice. It's studying and practice. If we do the things, I heard this great story. I shared it at the class yesterday. I read this story yesterday. It's not exactly connected, but we'll draw a parallel. There was a young man in England who was dating this woman, and it all made sense to him, but he wasn't feeling a heart connection. And he wrote, this is probably in the 50s or 60s, and he wrote a letter to the Rebbe asking for some guidance. And in those days, the Rebbe would often respond in very few words via telegram. And it was usually Hebrew words that were phonetically spelled out. And then they would mail the answer, the Hebrew answer, they would mail that to the recipient. But in order for it not to have to wait, the mail could take a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, they would send the answer via telegram. So, so he gets the response to his question. And in Hebrew, it says, Yasa Masim Lamshachas Halev. I'm not sure about the last two words, but it basically, that was the phonetic spelling of the Hebrew words, which he translated as do actions to draw the heart close. Yasa Masim Lahamshachas Halev. Do actions to draw the heart close. So he said, okay, got to take action. So I don't know exactly what he did. He brought her flowers and he called her up and said, how you doing? How's your day going? He started doing all of these actions to draw his heart close to her. And he suddenly found that the feelings were there. A few weeks later, he gets in the mail, he gets the Hebrew text. Now in Hebrew, the word ma'asim has two meanings. It means actions, and it also means aligned or consistent, which means, it seems that the Rebbe was telling him, do consistent with how your heart feels. In other words, if you're not feeling drawn to her, it's time to move on. But he didn't read it that way. He read it, do the actions that bring the heart close. And the result was that he found a closeness there. So I'll tell you another story. The previous Rebbe, after the Bolshevik Revolution in the early 20s, he lived in Rostov. The previous Rebbe was his father, who was the fifth Rebbe, passed away in 1920, just as the Bolshevik Revolution was underway. The communists were taking control. And the previous Rebbe knew his job was to fight communism. Anyway, and he did, and he was arrested early on. He was arrested many times. He was arrested. And one of the professors there, one of the interrogators was a Jewish professor, a communist. And he turns to the Rebbe and he says, I may not be quoting the story exactly, but the punchline will be correct. He says, I want you to convince me that there's a God, right? The communists didn't believe it. Convince me that there's a God. So the Rebbe says to him, it's like, you're asking me to do something like, if I'm a great astronomer and you're ignorant of astronomy and you meet me on the street and you say, I want you to convince me, about the planets and so on. He says, that's a silly question. says, come to the planetarium, where the scopes are, and we're going to look, and we'll look at the planets, and I'll show you what's there, and you'll study about it, and you'll experience it, and then you'll know about them, then you'll believe it. Says I can't convince you of Judaism. I can't convince you of the truth of God. You need to experience it. So somebody who wants to believe can experience that faith, but they have to invest themselves, starting with the actions, doing the things that a believing person does, and studying about it. It's not magic. It's a process. We gave the example, I think, about about frogs or grasshoppers or something a few weeks ago, right? If you want to fall in love with grasshoppers, you got to study them and go witness them and experience them and look at them. And eventually you'll become obsessed with grasshoppers, maybe, or maybe not. I don't know. But if you want to connect with God, and it's not a gimmick, it's there, it's inside of you, because you are a part of God. You are energized by the divine. But you're not going to experience it because your body does such a great job in hiding it. Because when you wake up in the morning, your first consciousness is me. Me, 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 me. Right? A child is born into the world, their fist clenched, screaming, I'm important here. The world revolves around me. And they cry when they need to go to the bathroom, and they need their diaper changed, and they cry when they want food, and they cry, and they throw tantrums. And we try to tell the child, yes, the world revolves around you, but you're here for a purpose. But that's the nature of the human being, is we're completely wrapped up in ourselves. So it's big competition. It's big competition between the body and the soul. So we got to chill out a little bit. Tell the body, hey, relax. It's not all about you. Let's dig a little deeper. Let's engage in some kind of spiritual practice where we can let the soul out a little bit. Let's experience that. Let's study. Let's meditate. Let's connect. And if we do that effectively, we let the soul come out. And then you don't have to convince anybody of anything. They experience it themselves. Right? You have people who, I have a friend, I just interacted with him when we were in Israel, who was feeling, he just didn't feel good, and maybe a little gout, and decided to become a vegetarian. And he stopped eating meat, and suddenly he feels good. And he said, I'll never go back to eating that food. Why? Because he feels different. I'm not pro or anti-vegetarianism. I'm just telling you the story. He now has a different experience. He feels differently. He knows a different thing. He knows a different way of being. So if somebody's interested in believing that doesn't think they believe, they have to engage. Got to engage in the experience of it. Engage in the experience of it. Then you'll know it. You'll feel it. It'll be you. All right, to be continued. Have a great week, everyone.